here at Jack's Books. I'm Colton, this is Doc. Why don't you kick us off, tell them a little about what we're doing here.
Absolutely. Well, we all love great literature from the world, and we're trying to understand the big ideas. Why are we here? Why are humans here? Who is God? Who is man? How do they relate? And these questions are hard to address in a sort of a one volume. There's no, if there's one volume that answers it, it's the scriptures. But other than that, world literature has had a lot to say about these things. And so I look forward to doing a broader lit review from A to Z, from beginning to end, from BC to AD, and just look at the great thoughts of the world.
So when we say the great thinkers of the world or the greats, what are some of those? Just to throw out some, what are we talking about?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously you'd probably start with Homer, because world history can be divided into 4 or 5 epochs. You've got prehistory, so that's out there, Stone Age. Then you've got actually ancient history, Egyptians and otherwise. You've got classical period, which is really starts sort of modern thought, if you will, from Homer. Classical period, 500 BC, 500 AD, and then you've got the medieval period and the modern period. So if you look at Homer from the ancient world, then you've got your Augustine, of course. Can't skip Plato, Aristotle, then Augustine, then on up through Aquinas, and then on up through all the moderns, Hume, Heidegger, Locke, and so forth. It's amazing. It's a wide and a deep world. The question is really not what matters, but how do you get down to what it matters most? How do you get to the real core of it? And that's what we're hoping to do in these next few years.
Yeah, great. And so what would you say, you've kind of hit on the why, but unpack that a little bit more maybe. What's at stake maybe if we ignore this? Because it sounds like a lot of work. You just listed a lot of thinkers, and maybe it's a little bit intimidating.
Yeah.
It may seem overwhelming at first. Why should we do it? What's at stake if we don't?
Yeah.
And what do we stand to gain by pursuing it?
And I kind of have 2 reasons that I'm not sure if they're 2 reasons or the same reason. But the first thing that comes to my mind is I had all these questions growing. I grew up in the Christian tradition, and I thought, do I believe this because I grew up in it, or do I believe it because it stands on its own against the others? And so I began to read outside the Bible, and that is what really kind of started this journey, to say, what did the great world thinkers say about life? And what did the Bible say about life? And how do those two interact and relate? And can the Bible stand with them? And does it lead them? Does it follow them? Where does the Bible stand in that? Where do my beliefs stand in the context of great world thinkers? And I think secondly, the reason this process matters, to go through all of this world literature, sort of geographically and historically. Lewis had a great quote. He said, "A man who's lived in many places is not likely to be deceived by the local airs of his native village," right? The scholar has lived in many times and therefore in some degree immune from the great cataract of nonsense that pours from the microphone of the age. In other words, if you've lived in many times, it sort of helps you understand the blind spots in your own time. And so that's what my hope is, that we can look at the great thoughts through all time to therefore help us see beyond the blind spots of our time.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I can very much identify with both of those. Similar,
what
had the same sentiment. As part of it is just a longing for truth. I want to know what is true and pursue that.
Yeah.
But one of the questions that comes up as you're thinking about that is, well, I have these set of beliefs, but why do I have that?
Yes.
And is it just because it's the community I was in or the culture? That's a pretty common objection. Elsewhere, else when.
Right.
What if you had been born in this place? You would think something else.
Right.
And so one way of pushing up against that is to actually put yourself in those different places and become familiar with them and see how they stand up.
That's right.
And so that was part of the thing that motivated me to begin. And I think, to speak to what we're doing here, as opposed to reading what, for example, maybe Christians have written about these people.
Right.
I don't think that's sufficient, right? You need to hear it from them. You need to go directly to the source. I think there's real...
I don't know if you've ever heard an argument against Christianity written by someone who's outside the faith, and you're like, that's not it at all. In fact, I was reading some of the atheists where I was just like, that's what you believe about what we believe in. And I thought, but the reverse is also true. I can imagine that, as we Christian apologists may look at Hinduism or Buddhism or atheism and think, we need to understand them on their own terms. I want to understand them from their point of view, not from our point of view. And so it was really important for me to get to the original writings, the original sources, whether it's religion or philosophy, and hear it from them in their words to understand them on their terms.
Yeah.
And because I felt misunderstood, and I'm sure they have too, and that doesn't help anyone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think to your second point, I also think about how the liability of exposing yourself to modern, whether it's modern works of literature, whatever it is, or the news, certainly,
Yeah.
without the background of historical
Yeah,
context.
right.
You know, and so Lewis has some great quotes on that, like
Yes.
the one you shared.
Yeah.
And so one of the best ways, I mean, I thought in the past, there's probably some ratio of reading old stuff to modern.
Right. Yeah.
Exposing yourself to that. It should be something like
10
10
to
to 1. So yeah, it's kind of, certainly is in line with that. So
Yeah.
you mentioned your background in the faith and how those questions, maybe tell us a little bit more about your background and how it relates to this project.
Yeah, so I went to Vanderbilt and I studied Russian and English, and so that opened me up to the world of literature and to world culture. When I graduated, I went actually and lived in Russia for most of 17-year period. From 1994, I moved there, and I moved out in 2011. So I was very familiar then with the Eastern world, the Eastern philosophers, and the Russian Orthodox branch of the church. 2015, again, some of these questions were really bubbling up then, East, West, ancient, modern. And so instead of coming all the way back to America, my family and I, we moved to England, and I did a PhD in history, and I had learned to love history in Russia, but I was really wanting to know, again, how does my faith stack up? Do the divisions in Christianity negate it, or are they a part of it, or where are we at on this? And then what about the greater conversation with world religions? How does that interact? And so I stopped off and did a PhD under John Coffey at the University of Leicester. We had the privilege to live in Cambridge, and so I kept a desk at Tyndale House in Cambridge for 3.5 years and interacting again with world scholars. And so then I moved back to America. So in my adult life, I've lived more than 3 years in 3 different countries, in the East, in an Orthodox country, in England, in sort of an Anglo-Catholic country, and then here in a Protestant country, and then seeing how those religions, if you will, interact. But I think that helped me on my journey to really confirm a lot of things and to respect and understand the place of the scriptures in the context of world literature and in my own faith. And the good news is, after a very long journey, it's been very much confirmed, but not without understanding that there are some difficulties to work through. And I've been very satisfied to do that. How about you?
Yeah, so I did not go to England to go to my PhD, so that's not my background. But I love, like I said earlier, I've just had this curiosity, and that can be sort of vain thing, but something deeper than that, and a real hunger and thirst for the truth.
Yeah.
And having come to know Christ, that really was the starting off point, really the introduction to me into philosophy and literature, these other things that I maybe wouldn't have ever even exposed myself to. But questions coming out of that, started to pursue that. And so maybe for the past 7 or 8 years have been kind of moving here and there, studying a little bit of this, a little bit of that, always trying to read, but then more recently getting more serious about it and thinking, hey, I need to be a little more structured in my approach to this and really get this foundation laid. I think of that as being history, philosophy, theology, and literature.
Right.
So these 4 things that kind of happen in parallel in this great conversation that unfold. And so really wanting to get into that. And I hope part of the value that I can bring in that regard is as a layperson, as a non-academic, both showing that it's possible. This isn't my job. I'm not doing this full time. So it's possible. These things aren't inaccessible. There's a great value to the academic background that people have, and they can speak to it in ways that lay people may not be able to. But it is possible.
Yes.
And so to provide that and maybe break things down as well. So.
Absolutely, and that's one thing that makes this great literature great, and another reason to go to the primary sources, because it is so much easier to actually read Plato than anyone who's written on Plato. Like the professors are 10 times more confusing. And I get it. We all think, it comes from humility, right? I think I can't meet face to face with someone like a Plato or an Aristotle or an Augustine or Aquinas. But actually, that's what makes them great, is that they were able to speak to the human condition in ways that we should all be able to understand. And so I'm so thankful that we can just get right into the actual sources, hear from the greats themselves in their own words, and then understand the great philosophies and religions, again, in their own words, on their own terms, from their own sources. And it's so much more accessible, I think, than people realize. And honestly, I feel like, and while I have the training, honestly, I feel like I'm kind of like you. I'm a person, a guy who loves literature, who loves thought, who loves ideas, and they matter. Those things matter in our lives because they help us place ourselves in context. Lewis, talks about if you've joined a conversation at 4 p.m. that started at 8 a.m., you may have missed a lot of context. And so that's why I think it's important to see the whole view of literature from start to finish, so that you're not just jumping into the conversation and deciding that what this means when they said X. But there were 30 things they already said about X that play into that. And so I think it's so critical for us to begin at the beginning and end at the end.
Yeah, 100%. And I think one of the values of doing it is, I think of Ecclesiastes, this idea there's no new thing under the sun.
Right. Yeah.
We face so many problems and we think of them as, this is this new issue that's come up. Let's think about it from the ground up.
Right.
As if this conversation hasn't been taking place.
And the world were born yesterday, yes.
Right. And so to sort of combat against that and actually reach into the past to bring forward things out of that conversation that matter so much today. Many of the things we're wrestling with are the same thing that they were wrestling with, maybe repackaged a little bit.
And you bring up a great point, Colton, because while certain sciences move forward, technology moves forward, and technology now is better than it was back then, other sciences don't, like the humanities don't. Like Plato can be a better writer than someone at the university today. And so the humanities don't progress in the same way that sciences do. And so the thought of the ancient world isn't barbarian. In fact, it's quite sophisticated. And unfortunately, the modern thought is often barbarian. When we're trying to take big thoughts and smash them down into a 20-second TikTok clip, you've done a great disservice to us all. And so I think for us to be able to reach back, we're not saying we want to go back to, riding around in chariots and bloodletting. What we're saying is that there are great, great ideas from the past that should endure. And to borrow a phrase from Tolkien, there are some things that should not be forgotten. And there's some things that need to be renewed in our day that we've lost to our hurt.
Yeah, 100%.
So looking forward to it.